Right. Well, thanks for having me, Morgan. And Morgan, if you could help me keep an eye on the chat and if there's questions, or again, we're a small group. So if people have a question about a certain slide, especially, don't be afraid to just unmute, stop me, and ask that question. It's great to see so many of you on a nice sunny day. Not going to lie, I keep looking out the window longingly and wanting to be outdoors. So I am honestly honored that this many of you wanted to hang out with me. So I am going to share some of the research that we've done at SDSU. And I just want to be very transparent. I know some of you know me and have been to my field days, and some of you maybe know me less well and haven't been to some of my field days. But I would say up until this point, we've kind of dabbled in cut flower research, and I really do want to grow this research program. So I want to start there. And I've had folks who have given me great feedback on research and ideas, and I've pursued a couple of different grants without success in funding. And it can be, as we know, it's difficult to do anything without money. I think we know that more than ever right now amid some of the federal funding unknowns. And I really hope none of you are impacted by any of the EQIP or conservation planning confusion or any of the other grant unknowns. But if you are, I'm definitely thinking about you. And, you know, that's really been on my mind. So all of that to say, everything I've done up to this point has been dabbling because it hasn't really been a formally funded research trial. But I'm excited to share that we have had one of our research trials published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so I'm going to be talking about our research trials with zinnias, which was the published research, talking about our research trials with snapdragons and sunflowers, both of which ended up being only a single season for reasons that I will get into when we get there. And nationally, there are some faculty who have really been doing cool things in cut flower research. And it's important to remember that, you know, at a national scale and even a global scale, research for the cut flower industry has been going on for a really, really long time. But the way they're thinking about that research has kind of shifted focus, which is a really exciting time for everyone in the Zoom room. Because we have seen research that used to really be focused on, you know, greenhouse cut flower production for places like California and Colorado. And I don't know how many people know this, but we actually have a really large rose grower in greenhouses called Len Bush Roses, actually in Minnesota. But I think many of us are also aware that when we go to a local flower shop, especially this time of year, those flowers are imported, and most of them are imported from South American countries. They have tons of sunshine because they're by the equator, which is great for growing lots of cut flowers. Obviously, many times they're paying way less for labor, for better or for worse. And they just have a really well-established, industry mechanism for cut flowers. So a lot of the research historically has been looking at, how to improve cut flower production in greenhouses and in closed environments, or, in the Pacific Northwest where they're doing some open field production. But we do have researchers who are starting to ask questions about small to medium scale production, open field, high tunnel. So I think it's a really exciting moment. But the reality is, all of you wonderful humans have kind of like beat the researchers to the punch in the sense that the cut flower industry for local cut flowers and small scale, on-farm cut flower production has taken off so quickly that I think a lot of us researchers are like, oh my gosh, we need to catch up and help you ask the questions that you want asked. So I think we're kind of at this tipping point where we're going to see a lot of really cool research come out in the next 5 to 10 years. So I just want to start with that caveat. And I am a big believer in everyone can ask questions about how to make their farm better, how to try new things. And so we're going to just touch the tip of the iceberg for how you can do trials on your own farm. And you might be like, I'm not a scientist, but I want you to know right now that you actually all are. Because if you take observations, make notes on what insect is eating your flower, or I don't know what this insect is, but this is what the damage looks like. You know, you're thinking using scientific inquiry. So we're gonna kind of wrap up with that. And I would be happy to share this presentation with Morgan to email out to the group. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole and was cross-checking that I wasn't reading a caption wrong that I copied from someone else, and I'll get to that when we get to that slide. So I just want to share that for folks that don't know me as well, because I do see some new names on the Zoom call. My role is primarily extension. I've been with SDSU for 4 years, and so I am an assistant professor and an extension consumer horticulture specialist. Part of that title is because I filled the role vacated by Dr. David Graper, who worked primarily with consumer horticulture. So, you know, working with greenhouses and nurseries and master gardeners and home gardeners and people interested in cut flowers. He actually did some work with cut flowers as well. And I've kind of widened that title to include working with specialty crop farmers, because that's really where my research interests lie. I love working with home gardeners, community gardeners, and specialty crop farmers, especially those of you in the room who are, you know, you're probably here because you grow cut flowers, but also people who do vegetable production. So I do have a team of graduate students. I've had one graduate student get her master's, and she works for the Illinois Extension System. She's been there for a year. I have currently Hannah and Connor are two of my graduate students that are going to be wrapping up in May. And Hannah is right here on the far side of the photo, and Connor is right there in the middle. And Hannah spent 2 years looking at soil tarping to reduce weeds and looking at the impacts on soil health. And Connor spent 2 years looking at clover cover crops as a living mulch and looking at growing the crop broccolini in living mulch to see if we could reduce yield losses. And what Connor has learned is broccoli, which we think of as, you know, the broccoli we eat, is super sensitive to cover crop integration and tillage reduction, whereas broccolini, which is a bolting or sprouting broccoli that you can harvest multiple times, is less sensitive, which is really exciting. Those are, and I just share that because I think there's tillage reduction techniques and cover crop integration techniques that can also apply to many of you on this call. And I will have a way to find all of our research reports at the end of this. And then we also have Christina Harms, who is not in any of these photos because she's my newest student, but she is working on organic cabbage and organic sweet corn production at our SDSU Southeast Farm in Beersford. And she's also looking at cover crop integration as part of that. And I will be the first to share that I'm always happy to see folks from this community at any of our field days. A date to save would be Tuesday, July 8th, from about 1 until 6 p.m. at the SDSU Southeast Farm. That is going to be their annual field day, and they have agronomic research. They'll show small grains and pasture and corn and soybeans and all of that stuff. But the fun part is hanging out with me and my team for the horticulture tour, where you could see the organic field trials. And we also do have a small high tunnel there that we will be growing lettuce in this year. So again, none of this work would be possible without all of these lovely humans. And I also employ hourly employees and have support from SDSU campus staff, as well as the SDSU Southeast Farm team. So what is up in South Dakota? I want to call out that we, again, have had opportunities to show our field trials at field days. The cut flower research that I'm talking about today has primarily been on our campus plots, so here in Brookings, and we have that annual field day. It's always a full week after Labor Day, and it's a Tuesday. So I believe this year that is Tuesday, September 12th from 4 to 7 will be our annual specialty crop field day. And you're going to hear more about the young woman in this picture right here, but this is Ellie Fitzpatrick. She was an SDSU undergraduate student who worked with me for 2 summers, and she actually ended up being the research lead for the cut flower trials. And now she is happily employed at Epcot doing an internship in controlled environment production. So she has a long career as a scientist ahead of her. Okay, so let's jump into the research because I want to leave time for discussion. So here was our zinnia trial. Um, you might ask, Kristine, why did you pick zinnias and snapdragons and sunflowers? When I approached this research, I didn't have a ton of cut flower production myself. I knew a lot of people were getting started, and I was trying to think about like what are common cut flowers that most of us are probably growing on our farms. And as you may or may not know or realize, again, most of you are probably just growing zinnias because they're not terribly hard to grow. They're pretty user friendly. They sell well. People really like them. But something else to think about for zinnias is they're such a good fit for a local summer cut flower market because they're kind of a pain in the tuchus for florists. You don't put them in a floral cooler the same way because they're very, very sensitive to cold injury. They don't ship super well. So zinnias are going to continue to be a really strong flower for local cut flower markets. Now I know they're probably not making you the most money per bouquet or per stem, but they can be a great filler and complement to some of those other more expensive flowers, such as lisianthus or snapdragons or ranunculus. So I started with a crop like zinnias because, again, an easy crop that chances are most of us are growing. Now, I already had ongoing cover cropping trials and plot layouts at SDSU, and we always have the edges of our research plots. There's always kind of an extra row. We call it a guard row. And we wanted to put something in it. And I'm a real sucker for a double dipper when it comes to research if we're already out there farming anyways. And I thought, you know what? Let's start with zinnias and snapdragons. Let's put zinnias and snapdragons out there. And I'm going to replicate these trials in such a way that I could see if the cover crops being next to it would have any effect. And I will say that we kind of very quickly realized the way it was planted that there wasn't enough cover crops surrounding the flowers to really tease apart if that was making an impact on production. So I pulled that piece out of the trial, and it just became a question of what are the differences between these four cultivars, which represent four unique series. My seed came from Johnny's. That can be laziness on one part, but I was trying to look for four series that, seemed quite popular, people were using. And again, you might recognize like, oh, I have planted Cinderella, or I have used the Benary's Giants before, or the Oklahoma or the Queen series. So again, hopefully some of you are going, oh, I have used these on my farm. And you might find that your results do vary because everything with, crop response can be very dependent on the location and the soil and the year, the season. So when we do research, it is standard practice to do that research for at least 2 growing seasons because user experience certainly can vary. We were delayed with field planting in 2022 because that was a cold, wet spring and we just were not accomplishing things in May of 2022. And then, and there was the derecho, so that was fun. And then in 2023, the season, I feel like that was the year that was maybe really super windy in the early spring, but that also might have been 2022. The years are starting to blend together, but I've got a slide with our climate data in a moment. But again, rainfall, timing of rainfall, temperature fluctuations in early spring, all of those things can influence, our cut flower seasons, as we know. So here's just an overview of our practices in 2022. I just want to start by saying that these dates are this year in 2022 for zinnias. Again, it was a cold, wet spring, and zinnias are a warm season flower crop, and so they can be sensitive to cold temperatures, and we weren't using row cover or high tunnel production or anything like that. And I acknowledge that I wasn't hustling to open up my U-pick in June, for example, which I know many of us are kind of still waiting for our flowers to grow in June, and we're really starting our U-picks late June and going later into the season. But in 2023, just when we get there, I want to acknowledge that we were quite short on labor. And since this was my extra research project, it was the last thing to get planted. So we planted quite late. So consider this an exercise in if I push my planting to, early June, or if I push it back to late June, this might be what my harvest results look like for my farm. We did use liquid fertilizer while the crop was in the greenhouse. We tried to do that once a week so that we had fertilizer and then a clean rinse so that we could leach out so there were no extra salts. So we were not fertilizing constantly, just because there were some concerns with salts. And that first year, especially of greenhouse production, there were some issues with some wonky looking flower transplants. We pinched our transplants once prior to transplanting, and that was after reviewing the work of Melanie Stock, Stock, at Utah State University, and some other guides. If you are going for, I'm doing wedding work or large vase work, you might not want to pinch. You are going to get blooms earlier. You're going to get that first set of blooms is going to be longer stems. If you are doing more mason jars, U-pick, things where you want lots and lots and lots of blooms and the stems don't need to be as long, pinching can be really beneficial, especially in early stages, to encourage branching. So we pinched once in 2022, and our field planting was June 6th. We did till our soil. So Chris Goldade, cover your ears. I see her on the call. And we did not use any pre-plant granular fertilizer that year. And part of that was an oversight on my part. And part of that was me going, you know what, we're going to just try to do liquid fertilizer only and see what happens. So 2022 and 23 were both kind of years of let's just try some different things and see what happens. And I think we can all relate to that. We used 3-foot wide landscape fabric because, again, we had cover cropping trials going on around this. And so we were just doing like single strips. I know many of you might have more of a large swath of landscape fabric if you're using that, and then be burning rows into that. But just know we had landscape fabric, a single row, and then we had cover crops that were kept mown on either side. So we did have some inherent competition for these flowers. But we had 9 plants per plot. And if anyone is a research nerd, we had 16 replicates of each individual flower cultivar, which was just how the layout worked out. And it allowed us to do statistical analysis and really tease apart differences, which was exciting. We did have 3 applications of liquid fertilizer at planting, and then later in the growing season, after we kind of had that initial flush of growth and things started to go downhill. Just a general comment on using nitrogen fertility sources. You want to be really, really careful that you're not overfeeding those flowers, because you can get to a point with many flowers that you're getting tons of green growth and you start to actually do that as a detriment to bloom production. So you want to make sure flowers have enough fertility so that they can recover from cutting and they continue to produce stems and produce blooms. But if you over fertilize, you can get a lot of green growth and actually start to stall bloom production. You can actually do the same thing to tomatoes, and I did it once in graduate school. So just something to be aware of. And harvest in 22 started on July 13th. Some photos of what our field prep and planting looked like. So again, the stuff planted around here is clover cover crops, some oat nurse crop, and then grass that we kept mowed. So that was the grid system that we used. There is also, of course, the opportunity to do the diamond stagger. Because of how I wanted to lay out my research plots, I really wanted to have, 9, 9, 9, just in very clear, clean rows that was easy to see for harvest and data collection. So that's part of the reason my grid isn't offset. I know that makes some of you in the room cringe, and there can be some advantages to spacing and sneaking in flowers on a diamond grid. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And here we were transplanting flowers, and then we did use a trellis and support system in year one. Timing and things got crazy in year two, so we didn't get our trellis put on time. And that was actually kind of a fun exercise in how many more curvy stems we would get in year two versus year one. So pay attention to that for the harvest data when I report it. And then in 2023, again, we planted earlier in the greenhouse, but then things sat in the greenhouse forever because we just got delayed with field planting and some labor shortages, and everything else took priority. So we pinched 2 times prior to transplanting, and part of that was me just trying to like slow these guys down and prevent so much root growth so they didn't get so root bound. I was not very successful in that. We definitely still had root bound crops. We did this year, knowing that we were putting kind of some unhappy transplants out into the field. We did start with an at planting fertilizer, and that was Sustain 824. That is a fertilizer that I believe is OMRI approved, or there are versions of it that are. It's a dehydrated poultry manure, so it smells exactly like you think it would. And we did that at a rate of 52 pounds per acre for nitrogen. And that was based on a soil test where we were trying to reach a total of 65 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the soil. And that was based on looking at some fertility recommendations from Utah State for cut flower production. We pinched 2 more times after planting, just trying to get, those flowers were really slow to root in at transplanting, and there was some heat damage, and I was just trying to like help out those plants by not having tons of foliage that we were losing water from. It was fairly successful, I'll say that. We did have quite a bit of grasshopper damage on our leaves, but those were leaves that we were going to be stripping anyways for post-harvest, so I didn't worry about that. Harvest started late in 2023, so August 2nd. So you can see right there some clear implications for if you pinch way more, you're definitely going to delay your production. And then it peaked the week of September 4th. So here's some climate data just as a refresher. And Ellie took the time to look at, the number of days where we had an air temperature above 90 degrees. We start to see a lot more damage to our flowers. Zinnias are, again, a crop that can tolerate high temperatures a lot more readily. As we think about our snapdragons, for example, when we had those days in July and August, 19 days with air temperatures higher than 90 degrees, that's a great way to stall out snapdragon production. Or things like our Lisianthus or ranunculus that are some of our cool season flowers can be really sensitive to that. And if you're looking at this and going, oh my gosh, I want to come back to this, I will give you the source for the entire publication where you can see all of these graphics. So harvesting for research trials is a little different than harvesting for our farms. I know, when you're harvesting for your cut flower farms, you're probably picking the best stems, like right as they're ready. You might be stripping and bunching in the field, or you're putting everything in buckets and dealing with it later, or you're just inviting people to your weekly U-pick and they're clean picking everything. For our research trials, we visited the fields once a week just because it took so much time and we were trying to juggle other projects. And anything where for snapdragons, for example, like a third of the blooms were starting to open or more, we were harvesting that. Zinnias, a full complete row of petals. As we know, for cut flower production, if we are the ones harvesting it and shipping it or using it in vase work or anything like that, we want to try to grab more of those immature flowers if possible. We know for U-pick, people like things to be fully open and wonderful and beautiful, and then they're going to get it home and it's not going to last quite as long. But that's just how it goes. But for our research trials, so we go through those fields once a week and we'd look for, a third of the blooms or more, or a fully formed row of petals. And we would pick that and anything that was more mature. And we would cut all of those stems down to, a nearest branching point and put everything in buckets. And we would count and sort every single stem, which, if you're thinking that sounds like it took a long time, holy moly, it did. I did the very, very first cut flower harvest for our snapdragons and zinnias, and then trained my students, and then they took over. Here you can see I hauled everything in and did it like on a table in the shade. As we got more and more flowers, we ended up just having a system where one person would harvest all the flowers. There'd be a label in each bucket so we knew which plot it was from, and Ellie would just stand there very patiently for hours, sorting flowers by stem length, and measuring and counting those stems basically on the tailgate of a pickup. So that was what Ellie spent most of her time doing. So here's some examples of some of the categories we sorted things into. We were looking at different stem lengths, which I'll have a table on that in just a moment. But we were also looking for what things made flowers unmarketable. So I'll call you to photo D in the lower left. And that was an example of, we had insect damage on the petals. And then we also, it looked like, just had poor petal formation as well. If you look at photo E, that's a great example of a very, very curved stem that, if we cut it shorter, it might work for a mason jar. But if we were thinking about, taller vase work, that's a stem that, if we were wholesaling to a florist, they would probably, they would be quite upset if we sold them all stems that look like that. And then if you look at photo F, that's an example of, we had some very wonky and uneven petal formation. And again, if it's just a random filler flower, maybe not a big deal. But I share these categories also for those of you who, we know folks in U-pick, they're probably picking all of it and thinking it's all lovely and wonderful. But as you're starting to work on, your own vase work for your farm stand, or wedding work, or wholesaling to florists, or going to the farmer's market, you know that you want to put your best stems out there. And so these were some of the categories that we were saying, like, no, that's not acceptable. And Ellie had a really keen eye and was very picky, which was great. I shared these graphics, so just so you can kind of see where like production was peaking and taking off. You can see that our fertilizer, I think, did make a difference as well. So, and just, timing and heat and, rooting into the soil. But this was all of our marketable stems, and we considered anything 8 inches or longer as marketable. And then we broke that into 2 unique categories from there, or 3 unique categories. Sorry about that. But we can see that our Oklahoma ivory, our Queen Red Lime, our Cinderella peach, they had some really nice peach harvest events. Our Benaries, Giant Purple, did really well in having nice long stem, but you're not going to get as many stems. So again, with plants, there's trade-offs. There are those unicorns out there where you can get lots of stems and lots of long stems, but it takes more resources and more time to get those really, really long stems. And so most plants, the trade-off is you don't have as much branching, you're not going to get as many stems overall. And this is stems per plant. So we took all of our data and divided it by 9 and did stems per plant. So this is something, if you're using similar-ish spacing to me, so if you're kind of doing somewhere in the 6 to 9 inches with your plants, or 10 inches, you could use this data and this research to kind of start to do some math on how many stems per plant you might be able to expect, which then can translate into how many bunches you could expect to sell and kind of help you set pricing. So that's part of the reason that we do this type of research is so that you can start to think about, what this could mean for your farm and your profitability. And again, things were a little bit different in 2023. Harvest peaked a little bit later in the season. We saw that Benaries and Zinderella peach were just kind of lower overall for this season, and we saw that Queen Red Lime and Oklahoma Ivory continued to have pretty consistent stems per week throughout the growing season. And again, you can see the differences that happen from, seasonality plays a huge difference. For example, the temperatures, all of that can make a difference. So, not that you necessarily want to count all of the flowers that come off of your farm for the entire season, but if there are times where you'd like to know, okay, how many stems am I getting, or what's going on, at least even just keeping track of how many bunches you're getting from each variety and kind of doing that on a weekly basis, you'd be able to generate graphics like this and see, okay, all of my flowers are peaking at this point, and I have nothing earlier in the season. Maybe I should look at some earlier season varieties, or maybe it's great that everything peaks at the same time because you want to have pick Palooza in August. But there are ways. All of these graphs were just generated in Excel, and I know different people have different comfort levels with Excel. But this is analysis that you could actually do with your farm if, depending on what you were tracking. And it could be a great farm decisions tool for, what's working well and what should I maybe not plant in the future. All right, so this is our full harvest results. And again, we did have 3 categories. So we looked at zinnia stems that were 18 inches or longer. We looked at anything that was between 13 and 17.99 inches, anything that was between 8 and 12.99 inches, and anything then that was less than 8 inches. And this is one way to show data, a p-value that you can see right here to help with, if you haven't looked at many research reports, or if you have seen research and you're like, what in the world does all of this mean? A p-value is a statistical value that tells you the probability of that difference being due to a treatment. In this case, the treatment is the 4 different cultivars. And so the smaller that number is, the more confidence you can have that that difference is due to what you did, aka in this case, planting 4 different types of flowers versus some random chance in the universe. And that's one step in statistical analysis. So that's called the analysis of variance. And then another step is to use a least significant difference. And we typically do that, the value is 0.05. And anything that has a value that's 0.05 or smaller means that those 2 unique things are truly different from one another. And so we then use letters to indicate what things are different. Because Benaries Giant Purple and Queen Red Lime both have an A behind them for 18, that means that from a statistics standpoint, they had the same number of 18-inch stems per plant in 2022. And we can see in both years that Benaries Giant Purple had the longest, or the highest number of 18-inch or longer stems. So confirms what many of us know, or if you didn't know, that Benaries Giant Purple, if you're doing tall vase work, great option to pick for your farm. And the letters only correspond in this case to differences within columns within years. So you can't go across the rows just because we didn't do the analysis that way. We're only comparing what are the differences between the 4 types of flowers in the 13 to 17.99 inch category. And we can see in both years that Oklahoma Ivory had the highest volume of those medium length stems. And then we can see with Zinderella Peach that it pretty consistently had the highest number of those short stems. So Zinderella Peach would be a great option for mason jars, or like children's bouquets, or or U-picks where people maybe aren't thinking about stem length. So, each of these flowers can serve a purpose. But it's, it depends on what your market is. So any decision with farming, as much as we hate to maybe think about like talking to people or dealing with customers, because some of us get into farming because we love plants and we don't want to talk to people. But I think in flower farming, you're a much more personable storytelling community. But you need to think about like, how are these flowers being used? And that should help you consider, whether you're looking at my research or someone else's, what that means for you and your farm. Remember when I talked about not using horizontal netting in 2023? See how our curved stem numbers went up per plant? Just goes to prove using horizontal netting in South Dakota is a really good idea, even for bushy stuff like zinnias. So just something to keep in mind. I know some people do or do not net the zinnias, and I kind of had just like a mini experiment in there of doing it one year. And again, things just got a little off the rails in 2023. So take home messages. Cinderella peach, it's a very unique flower. I love that scabiosa type, but it's kind of for more the cute petite work. If you are doing a lot of vase work and, are doing taller cups for U-picks, I would go with one of the other three. And just kind of a nerdy shout out, but Ellie Fitzpatrick actually won a research award at SDSU for her work. So we were really proud of her. And if you want to read the full publication, this QR code will jump you there. Ellie is the lead author. And then we also had Hannah Voy and Alexis Barnes, two of my graduate students who contributed to this work. And you can see all of the information and all of the details on how we grew those flowers. And real quick, you might be wondering, where did the flowers at SDSU go? Some of them went home with the student crew because they had worked really hard on it. We did try some retail sales in partnership with McCrory Gardens, and that went okay. My goal was to try to, I didn't want to take away the business from any of the local cut flower farmers. So as I work on flower trails in the future, I'm trying to think about ways that, those can be retailed somewhere through campus or go into, I don't know. Wouldn't it be cool if my flowers ended up in like bouquets in the president's house or something? So those are my new aspirations, but I'm trying to find market channels that aren't competing with, anything that you all are doing out in the world. And if anyone ever has questions or concerns or feedback about that, please don't ever hesitate to reach out, because, my goal and extension is to make sure that you get to do what you're doing really, really well. I can't bear to throw away all the flowers either, because that would make me really sad. All right, quickly trekking along. Time flies when you're having fun. We did 1 year of Snapdragon trials. Again, that's because we had a greenhouse crop failure in 2023. And I was like, all right, we're going to pivot to sunflowers because we can direct seed those. So we did, again, 4 unique series of Snapdragons. We did start those earlier in the greenhouse, and we could have probably gotten into the field on from a temperature standpoint earlier, but conditions were really wet and gross, the scientific term. So if we will recall, that was, let me think about that. No, 2023 was the year that it was hard. We had so much snow late into the season. So we kind of had wet, soggy soils both springs, if I'm recalling right, but for different reasons. 1 year was for rain and 1 year was for snow. Again, similar tillage, similar fertility. Harvest for Snapdragons started July 6th. It really slowed down in August, which again, we had 19 degrees above 90 degrees. And then it came back in September. So we had 12 total harvest events through September 28th. So these were the pinch Snapdragons. Snapdragons are a crop, based on what we learned in 2022 and 2023, that are a little bit finickier about the watering. If they sit too soggy, you might see some serious issues. And I was more than likely in the greenhouse over fertilizing them, and we were having some salt accumulation issues. So If you're ever running into production issues with your snapdragons in the greenhouse, don't hesitate to reach out. A reminder that we have the plant diagnostic clinic here on campus, and Connie Tandy, the diagnostician, has an extensive background in greenhouse production, and so she is a wealth of knowledge in troubleshooting any greenhouse production issues. So if you ever run into anything wonky, don't hesitate to let me know. Getting to the meat of the issue, here were our harvest results. Again, this is only 1 year, so take this with a grain of salt. I don't have multiple seasons to see how things averaged out. But we found that Potomac Orange had the highest number per plant of 18+ inch stems that were nice and straight and beautiful for vase work. And that Costa Apricot had the smallest stems, because again, A means that Potomac Orange was head and shoulders above everyone else. The B means that Madam Butterfly Bronze and Orleans Lemon Yellow had similar numbers of stems, and then Costa Apricot with a C had the fewest. And then we can see where some of that data kind of flips, where it's not a huge surprise then that Potomac Orange had a lower number of short stems, and the other three had higher numbers of the shorter stems. So again, snapdragons are one where you can do a lot of nice tall vase work, get some really nice clean lines, but you can still also do mason jars or shorter vases, or again, like really cute U-pick cups with some of these other snapdragons. So again, just considering your markets. Now remember that snapdragons are one that they, if they start to grow sideways, they are going to naturally try to right themselves, so you can get some really curvy, funky stems. Or if snapdragons are put into a vase at an angle, they ultimately are going to curve back up. It's just a natural response in snapdragons. So if you kind of start with everything at an angle, your vase work is going to look really cool for a day or two, and then slowly or surely all of those snapdragons are going to start to curve back like straight up to the sky. We can see that Costa Apricot definitely had the highest number of short stems. And I like sharing the stem curvature response, because we can see that Madam Butterfly had the lowest number of curved stems, which again, if you are having issues with funky looking snapdragons, might be something to consider. So again, take home messages. And what I liked about this is just kind of using 2 yellows and 2 orange apricot-y colors, because, the pale colors were kind of in at that time, to help give direction on what to grow. All right. So last but not least is sunflowers. Please take my sunflower results with a grain of salt, and you'll understand in a moment why that is. And we went with all branching sunflowers so that we could cut and come again. So I want to start with, again, the snapdragons, the sunflowers were also from Johnny's, and they were all branching. So sunflower overview, the biggest difference is these were direct seeded, and we did 2 rows in our 3-foot wide landscape fabric. And it was 18 inches apart within the row, 12 inches between those 2 rows. And we had 4 plants per plot, which is a pretty small plot size from a scientific perspective. So it's hard to say like this, if you plant these 4 sunflowers, you're going to get these results, because we just don't have enough data to support that. So consider these preliminary results. We had some deer difficulties. For folks who have been to my field on campus, 2023 was the last year that we did not have a fence, and we have some hangry deer that live in a grove of trees just north of us. And I was kind of, I was really rallying and cheering for a fence to be put up, both for like security from like students coming and picking my flower research, and from deer. So I was hesitant to drop a bunch of money on deer fencing, and I paid for it. So deer will typically in theory, leave older sunflowers alone, but they don't mind those hairy leaves on those teeny tiny young sunflowers. So our sunflowers were pinched. They were pinched by the deer, but we had two sets of replicated plots that were so severely damaged we had to drop those out of the study. So these research results only represent 8 replicates instead of 16. So a smaller data set, but we can see here that Chocolat had the largest number of 16 inches or greater stems. Soroya was similar to Chocolat. And then we start to step down, and Buttercream had the fewest number of long stems. Now, what's different than some of the other, like with the snapdragons and zinnias, is we just saw overall that Chocolat either recovered from the deer damage better, which is something to consider, or it just in general had kind of trended towards the higher stem count. But because we had fewer replicates and so much variability, and you can see here that the scale is not a lot of stems per plant either way, but we actually didn't see any differences in the number of short stems. So again, this was very preliminary data with a lot of things that went wrong. So don't bet the whole farm on Chocolat sunflowers based on the results of this research. Just something to consider more so. And we saw, probably because there were just more stems, but we had a lot of stems with insect damage. And so if you are doing no spray flower farming, a reminder that there are products, especially in South Dakota, there are products labeled for use on sunflowers. But if you are spraying any type of a pesticide on your farm, organic, non-organic, I don't care. If you are selling $1,000 or more of a product commercially, you really should get a private applicator license according to South Dakota law. And there is a free course that you can take through SDSU Extension. And we've had Stephen Robertson speak to this group before. But if you just look up private pesticide applicator SDSU Extension, you can find the information on that course. And again, technically it's the law, but it also, you're going to learn about how to not damage pollinators. You're going to learn how to read a label. You're going to learn, most importantly, how to keep yourself safe, because even if you're using organic pesticides to control insects on your flowers, there are still skin and eye and lung irritants, even if those products are organic. So it's just, please do that if you haven't. It's just great education for you and your family and your cut flower farming team. And just always remember that if you are using a product, the label is the law. And if it's not labeled for use on that flower, that's technically an illegal use. So just a note on insects. So a very lackluster take-home message. Not a lot of stems from Buttercream, more stems from Chocolat, but again, don't bet the farm either way. All right, some things to think about. I have some plots that are kind of going out of production, and I'm going to be looking at some ways to fill them with pumpkins and sunflowers, kind of thinking about my fall field day. And so I am curious in trial ideas, and maybe folks just want to take a second to drop in the chat as I'm talking, but would you rather see trials with branching sunflowers or single stems? Are there certain colors that are more important to you? Certain cut flower seed suppliers that you're like, you should really look at these, or certain series? And if you want to give opinions on pumpkins, that's great. But if everyone could in the chat just take a second to share maybe some trial ideas, I would love it. And I'm hoping Morgan can save that chat and email it to me. And also, if you need more than 30 seconds to think about it, don't be afraid to shoot me an email. I'll have my information at the end. So again, if you want to read about the cut flower trials, the sunflower and snapdragon, Ellie wrote the research reports and then she graduated and we didn't get to finish them. So I grabbed the data that we have and I just need to finish those and get those on the extension website. So that's on me. But our zinnia research is out in the world and trial results from McCrory Gardens and trials from the graduate students looking at the different soil management techniques are also on our website. So really, really, really quickly, I just want everyone to know that research now more than ever is super accessible. So if you are ever interested in trials on Lisianthus or peonies in high tunnels, a great place to start, just because I think it's a user-friendly website, and since 2020, all of their research articles are open access, is the ASHS publication website. And I forgot the QR code, so maybe in the background, Morgan can just low-key Google ASHS publications and put that in the chat for me. Sorry about that, Morgan. But there are two journals, the journal called Hort Science and Hort Technology. Both have some great cut flower research. So you could just put in ranunculus or celosia as a search term, and or you could look at like high tunnel peony, and you're going to find research from Melanie Stock at Utah State. So this is just a great way to query national databases. This is just an example of some of the current research that's out there. So I've mentioned Melanie Stock a few times. She is a soil scientist by training, and she has focused her research program very narrowly on cut flower production in Utah. And so there's some really cool information coming out of her program that's useful for farmers. And we just have to remember that, you know, their season is a little longer and their winter is less extreme, is one thing to think about. And I just want to show another way to interpret research findings. So again, she used those p-values, and she was looking at comparisons. So she was looking at Chantilly versus Potomac and seeing, was there a difference in the number of stems grown in the field in 2018 and 2019? And what she found was Potomac had more stems in 2018, and in 2019, Chantilly had more stems. For total number of stems. And then the number of marketable stems, Potomac had more stems, which tells us there were a lot of stems that were curved or had some sort of damage. And then she also looked at planting in late April versus late May in open field conditions. And she found that planting in late April resulted in way more stems per plant. So this is just one snapshot. She also looked at high tunnel production, but just know that there are researchers that are out there looking at timing of transplanting, and that's something I'm also really curious about. And hopefully it's something that you've just dabbled with on your farms as well. There are some great fact sheets for field production. So getting peer-reviewed published research can take several years. By the time you do the project, you write about the project is reviewed. Fact sheets tend to be a way that we're getting research results out there a little quicker, whether it's me or Utah State or others. So you'll see a lot of her preliminary research results on this page, and she has it organized by cut flower type, and I think she's got at least 10 different species on there at this point. If you want to learn more about post-harvest handling, Dr. John Dole is with North Carolina State, and he has basically dedicated his career to cut flower production, and he has dedicated a lot of time to what solutions we should put in our water, when things should be harvested so they store longer, at what temperature should they be stored. So there is a wealth of information from John Dole that's out there. And this is kind of dorky, but if you're into it, if you ever want current research sent to you, I use Google Scholar, and I set what are called alerts. And so these are the key terms I use. And so I use the term local cut flower. And that way, anytime a scientist somewhere in the world, actually, but it ends up being a lot of the United States research, does something with cut flowers, Google sends kind of this weird email where it's just basically links. And some of the links are like research that I'm like, I don't think that's relevant. And then some of it's like, oh, Utah State put out something new, or someone over in New Hampshire did research on cut flowers and high tunnels, and now I can read that report. So something to think about. I mean, you could put in, if you were like, I only want to know about Lysianthus, or I only care about sunflowers, you could do, local sunflower cut flower, or some sort of a phrase of key terms so that that research is sent to you. And I just always want to highlight that the Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers has some awesome education. Of course, SPA has awesome education. But what I love about the Association of Cut Flower Growers is they have some really cool research-based books. And there are lots of books out there on cut flower farming. But these are some of the first 4 that I purchased. Actually, I don't have woody stems yet, but I'm hoping that maybe Rhoda Burrows will gift it to me at some point. Because I know she has a copy. She's actually good friends with John Dole. But John Dole, again, the person who dedicated his career to post-harvest handling, he is the lead author on the post-harvest handling book, and he is a co-author on the woody stems book. These are just really, really fun resources. All right, Morgan, I want us to have time for questions and discussions. So next time I come back, in April, let's start with this slide. I'm going to jump to really quick. I do want people to know, especially if you are an early years cut flower farmer and want more design experience, I want you to know that we are doing cut flower camp again, and I'm really excited. The date has been set for Saturday, April 12th. The registration page is not quite yet open because I just needed to get a few more things pulled together and have it designed on our website. But this QR code jumps you to the overall extension events website. And so if you keep an eye on that, you'll see registration open, and that's going to be at McCrory Gardens in Brookings. If you want to get that information in newsletter form because you don't want to check the website, please subscribe to our newsletter. We would love to have you do that. Give folks a minute to grab the QR code. And again, I am always happy to chat. I've had just this week someone reach out, can you help me think about some grant ideas? I've had someone else reach out and say, hey, can you help me with my soil test interpretation after I get the results? And the answer to both of those is yes. So never hesitate to throw me an email. That's a great way to get a hold of me because then I have all the information in one spot. So again, Kristine.Lang@sdstate.edu.